All right, thanks so much, everybody, for being here. I'll try not to trip over somebody's iPad. Sorry about that. My name is David Smith. I work for one of the big tech companies that you've definitely heard of. I do developer relations. I specialize in artificial intelligence. But I'm not going to talk about any of that here today, because this is a personal trip, and I wanted to tell a personal story. Now, when Steve told me I was going to be doing the wrap-up talk today, I was like, you really want me to do this talk with this title at the end of the day before we all go and enjoy ourselves and have beers? But this is a talk that I've wanted to give, and this is the only venue where I can give a talk like this. It's inspired by the death of my husband, Jay, almost 3 years ago now. And I am going to try and make this talk not so much of a downer by focusing more on the practical and technical aspects of dealing with death and grief. When you talk to people about death, people naturally focus on the emotional side of it, and that is super, super important. I will be touching on that, of course, when I talk. But I thought Jay and I were well prepared for this situation, and it turned out that there were a bunch of things that nobody had ever told me that I was going to have to deal with through that process. And so I thought I would share those things with you in the hope that you might be prepared when it happens to you, because it happens to all of us at some point in our lives. This is Jay on the right there. That's me on the left. You might not be able to guess that, but yeah, that photo was taken only in 2019, so I've gone very gray through all of this process. That photo, I actually went through my iPhone and found the last photo of us together before our lives very suddenly changed. Just a couple of months after taking that photo, Jay was unexpectedly diagnosed with leukemia. He was just at his hospital, at the doctor's rather, just for a routine checkup, happened to faint in the doctor's office. They sent him to the hospital there. They did some routine blood tests to figure out what was going on and discovered that his blood cell counts were all wrong and he had some form of leukemia. My first tip is when you do your annual physical with your doctor, do ask them to do a complete blood count as part of that process. It's not routine. Had it been done in Jay's case, we might have detected it quite a bit earlier than we did. So that was the diagnosis. I also want to mention that there are a few people in this room that have met Jay before. He actually came with me as an attendee of Monktoberfest back in 2017, I think it was. He was an amazing man, and I wish I had a lot of time to talk about him personally. But like I said, I'm going to try and focus on the practicalities here. I do want to give a disclaimer that I'm not your lawyer, I'm not your doctor, I'm not your therapist, I'm not your financial planner, I'm not your estate planner or your tax advisor, although I am going to touch on all of these topics and my experience in dealing with those topics through this process. I also want to emphasize that I've talked with a lot of people about this topic, especially over the last few years, and everybody's experience is different. I just want to emphasize that this is the experience of one very privileged, childless, gay couple from California. And your experiences, or those of the people you love, might be different as well. But I did want to share what I had learned through this process that nobody had ever told me before. So let's talk about preparing for this eventuality. Like I said, I thought Jay and I were well prepared with this. As a gay couple, we were married in 2004 in Canada, but that was before gay marriage was legal in the United States. And so as we were traveling back on the road from Vancouver to Seattle, this became very apparent to us when the American border agent asked us, why are you coming to the United States? Or why were you in Canada was the question. And we said, well, we just got married in Canada. And he said, well, you're not married here. Welcome back. So thank you for that. But we were lucky in the sense that because we were a married couple living in a country where our marriage wasn't recognized at that time, we did go through a lot of the processes you need to go through to prepare for death, like writing medical directives for each other so that we would have the right, which was not a right for us as a couple, to go to a hospital and direct what healthcare should happen in the event of an accident or something like that. We went through the process of writing our wills so that in the event of one of us having to inherit from the other, there would be no contention that in the eyes of the American society, we were just two random people that happened to live in the same house. So we had to be very careful about the way we wrote our wills that our wishes would be followed. But as I found out, there was a lot more that we needed to do, even after marriage became legal in the United States, and we adopted so many benefits that come with being married. So that's my second tip here, is get married. I mean, whether you love people or not, I mean, there are so many benefits that come in American society with being married that just, it was night and day for us in the process of that becoming a legal thing. And also all the rights that I had as Jay's actual legal spouse throughout this process. A lot of what I'm talking about that I was able to do just simply wouldn't be possible. And I feel for any unmarried couple, just the way the law works, having to go through this. One of the things that we did after Jay was diagnosed is he went to a lawyer to try and figure out, is everything in order at this point? Because especially that first diagnosis was devastating, because at that point we didn't know what kind of cancer Jay had. There are different varieties of leukemia, it turns out. Some of them are essentially an immediate death sentence. Some of them you can live with for life with modern drugs that are available now. When we eventually got the diagnosis of exactly what variant of leukemia Jay had, we actually thought he would die of old age rather than with their leukemia. It didn't work out that way, but this is the thing. But it did prompt us to actually get our affairs in order. As I mentioned, I work for a big tech company. One of the benefits is you get a legal benefit that you pay for every month. You probably only thought about using it for getting out of parking tickets. But one of the really good things it does provide is the establishment of wills and trusts. That's one of the main reasons these benefits exist. So do take advantage of it if you haven't done that. Certainly establish a will. But it actually turned out that setting up a trust was important in our particular situation, and probably is in yours as well. I didn't have a lot of time to do these slides. I only found out I was doing this talk a week ago, so excuse the scrolls here. But imagine you're a married couple. Married is not necessary in this case, because a lot of what applies, but let's assume they're married. As a married couple, you probably have assets. You have bank accounts. You might have property, homes, for example. And the normal process is that you would each write a will, which basically says that in the event of one or the other's death, that your share of those properties, the bank accounts and the properties and so forth, will go to the other person. And you can also add all the other things into the will about other people there as well. I'm just focusing here on the two couple. That does work, but there are two problems in the United States, and particularly in California, where we live with that process. The first is just an administrative one, is that the will says you take your share of those properties from your deceased partner, but you still have to go through the process of changing the ownership, rewriting deeds, all that kind of stuff. So that's a hassle at a bad time. There's also another issue, which is that wills generally have to go through a process called probate. Can't go into all the details here, but it basically means you've got to file the will with your local county. There's an opportunity for people to challenge it. That can take a long time, first of all. And secondly, at least in California, I'm not sure what it's like in other states, but by statute, the lawyers will take at least 5% of your entire asset base, which is transferred through the will at that point. And this is why lawyers recommend setting up something called a trust. So like in the same way that we heard earlier on that, thanks Chris, you can use lawyers to set up an open source foundation. You can also use lawyers to set up this entity, which is called a trust. It's basically an organization that you and your spouse co-own, your trustees technically, of that trust. And for the developers in the audience, you can think of this it's kind of like pre-allocated memory for inheritance with an indirect pointer. And the way it works is you take all those assets that you have as a couple and you transfer ownership of those assets to this trust organization. So that's the pre-allocated memory part of it. You've gone through the whole process of changing the ownership before the actual death happens, saves you a lot of hassle and time. And also that pointer is about whichever one of the two spouses dies first, the ownership of the trust automatically reverts to the other one. So there's nothing you technically need to do there. It's, for most legal purposes, it's treated exactly like inheritance, but it avoids that whole probate process. A few other things about preparation to talk about, especially in this digital world that we live in. Think about the features that various platforms provide you, like Google's inactive account manager. If somebody doesn't touch a Google account for 30 days, you can designate who that goes to. So executor of my will is my Google's inactive account manager. Social media companies don't do any of this very well at all. Lots of issues here, but it turns out that the real solution to this problem is passwords and second factor authentication and getting access to the passwords and 2FA of your deceased spouse. We were lucky in this sense. We had both used LastPass. There's a password manager I do not recommend. But it had a nice feature that you could designate somebody that in the event of an emergency, you could request access to all those passwords. And if they didn't respond in a certain amount of time, we had set 24 hours, you would automatically get access to all of those passwords. This was absolutely necessary for me to manage all of the digital affairs that we had together. The other part of that is 2FA, second factor authentication. Also know your spouse's PIN code to get into their smartphone so you can access their authenticator apps or access their email to be able to get access to those codes. So that's the preparation side of it. I also want to talk a little about kind of what happens when at that final moment. Like I said, we had thought Jay was going to live forever. Everybody does. But in the end, it was quite sudden. Happy to share the details of that over a drink if you want to know it. One thing that I really wasn't prepared for was the questions that you get from hospital staff right at that very moment when somebody dies. This all happened during the height of COVID. And so Jay was in the ICU for about 3 weeks in San Francisco at the end. Luckily, through that whole process, we could only have one visitor at a time, and there was a whole process of figuring out who was going to be the visitor each day. But at the very end, when we knew it was his final moments, the staff at UCSF actually allowed all of his family and friends to come up to his bed at the ICU for that very last moment, which was wonderful. The first question, of course, that you'll get, this is what I did expect, was, do you want to turn off the life support? And that's when that medical directive becomes so important, particularly if you're not married. But there were 2 other questions which I did not expect at all. The first one was, well, first of all, you got to sign some forms about the time of death and all that kind of stuff. And then they asked, what do you want to do with the body? Are you going to bury? Are you going to cremate them? And I'm like, Jay and I had discussed this, but we hadn't discussed it in front of his friends and family that were all there around after that time. So I wasn't really ready or prepared to answer that question at that point. We went for cremation, as it happens. The other question that came at that time, again, I wasn't prepared for, was, do you want an autopsy? And I was just like, he died of leukemia. Why would we ever want to have an autopsy? But I was really stuck at that point, and they're like, what am I supposed to do in this situation? Luckily, Jay's father was in the room and chimed up and said, we don't really need an autopsy. And I was just relieved not to have to, say anything at that point. But be prepared for that one, because that one really caught me by surprise. So that's the moment of death. And then, of course, what happens immediately after that is the grief. And Eamon talked about the 5 stages of grief. this morning, which is a very helpful way to think about it, especially as you are preparing. It does explain a lot of the changes that go on through that process. But something that I really wasn't expecting was how much grief fucks with your brain. You know, I'm a smart person. I rely on my brain. My job is to innovate and ideate and all those kinds of things. What I wasn't prepared for was the way that the grief stopped me from thinking in a very, very fundamental way. I don't know if it's depression or grief or whatever. Maybe it doesn't even matter. But I suddenly cared about absolutely nothing. From I don't care if I get out of bed in the morning. I don't care what I have to eat, even if I do eat. I don't care about my future. But the implication of that is that it completely removes your ability to make decisions. When you don't care one way or the other, there's no basis to decide anything. And so as a result, you can't decide anything, and as a result, you can't do anything. And I had a lot to do, suddenly, at this point. We had named each other as executors of our will, and that means you have a lot of responsibilities of things that you need to get done. That is one choice I really do regret, is naming myself as my spouse's executor. Hire a lawyer. You know, get somebody in to do that, because you don't want to be doing that yourself. All right. Just one last thing I want to mention is something that did help me a lot later on in that process with the grief and help my brain come back was antidepressants. Not something I'd ever done before, but I talked to my doctor about my problems, and then he suggested doing this. And that was the only thing that really got me to be able to move again. Just one little caution here. Again, I'm not a doctor, but at one point during this process, I thought, hey, I'm all good. You know, the antidepressants have fixed me. And I decided to stop taking them. And I won't go into the details, but I really needed to have people around me at that point to help me through that. I'm back on again, and it's good, but that was a scary moment for me and lots of others. Execution. I use that word because of the whole executive thing. You know, this is the point where I had to be the executor of the will, and like I said, I regret choosing that. You know, one of the things you've got to do, of course, is you've got to decide, you know, having a funeral or a wake or a showing and organizing all that kind of stuff. A surprise to me in that process is that's when death certificates start coming up. It's the funeral director that actually issues the death certificates, and the death certificates is something you absolutely need to be able to move on with the rest of the process. I asked for 20 copies of them because a lot of like insurers, for example, need physical copies mailed to them. It takes about 3 weeks for them to come back from the state, at least in California. Make sure you have those because you'll be needing them. You have to deal with the government. Social Security, of course, you've got to deal with. One of those benefits of being married is that you are entitled to your spouse's Social Security and it starts paying out from the age of 55. I don't believe that's true if you're not married. Also, a little random Social Security thing, they send you a check for like $250 that just appears in the mail to help with the funeral expenses. Like, where does that come from? All right. You've got to deal with all the bank accounts, of course. You know, and this is where having the trust set up so you don't have to transfer any names, all that is important. We did actually make one little mistake. There was one particular account that we hadn't actually got around to transferring the ownership or the beneficiary to the trust. So then I had to get the lawyers involved, and it was going to go to probate, but then because we had a note in the trust document saying we were going to put it in, but we didn't, we wanted to get a letter written, we didn't have to do that, but just so many complications. Another thing to deal with, of course, is life insurance. We had both taken advantage of the life insurance from our employers, which you may also be able to cover your spouse with your employer's life insurance. We had done that. That was very unfortunate. Very fortunate, rather. One of the benefits of being married is that both the life insurance and all the inheritances are tax-free. That was something I had worried about, what was going to happen further down the line. That's true at a federal level. It's also true at a state level in every state if you're married. It varies state by state if you're not married, so you might want to have a look into that as well. Then, of course, there's the whole process of dealing with that digital life. As I said, I had the passwords to all of Jay's accounts. That makes things so much easier. One thing to watch out for, though, is that, one time I was sitting in my bedroom. Jay's iPhone was sitting on his dock on the side of his bed, where it always is. And suddenly it lit up, and it said, iPhone erasing. And I panicked, because this was my way into all of the processes that I needed to do. Turned out that Jay's employer was remotely managing it through Intune or something, and had initiated a remote wipe because he was no longer with the company. No fault of the company. They were actually great, really helpful throughout this entire process. But it's something I wasn't expecting and was pretty traumatic at the time. Turned out not to be a big issue because I could just use iCloud backups to restore Jay's phone without the management, and everything I needed was there, but something to be aware of. All right, it's time for a palate cleanser. Thank you, Ashley, for normalizing pictures of dogs on slides. This is my dog, Dawson. When I got him, when I fostered him, he was just a little bundle of fluff this big. I had no idea what he was. I fostered him with his mother. She looked like she was half German Shepherd, half Husky. He's probably half Labrador from the way he looks. But he has been amazing for me. He's been, one of my real pillars of support, and really helped me with my recovery. Because one of the things that I discovered pretty quickly after all this happened was that I couldn't be alone. Jay and I lived in our house together in California, and suddenly it was just me. My mum did come over from Australia. She was on the literal first flight from Sydney to San Francisco after the COVID lockdowns ended, and she came and stayed with me for 3 months, which is as long as a tourist visa will allow one to do. My sister came out for a while, but it was actually my mum that convinced me to go and foster a dog, and that's where Dawson came from, so that was amazing. There was also a rotating cast of characters that came and helped me out during that first initial period, brought me food, brought me comfort, absolutely necessary. But after a while, that dwindled off, and Mum and Rebecca had to go back to Australia. And suddenly I was home alone in the house that Jay and I had built together. And I did not cope with that. But I had a savior on that front, my best friend Johnny, who's actually here giving emotional support to me, giving this talk today. Thank you, Johnny. And Johnny has also given me emotional support throughout this entire thing, and still does today. He lives together with me in my house and has got me through this. So thank you so much for being here, Johnny. Just more on the recovery thing. I took 3 months off of work. I did the whole bereavement thing, absolutely necessary. I couldn't have done a thing if I'd been there, so there's that. Something that really helped me randomly is jigsaw puzzles. In that first period, and even still a bit today, because of the whole brain not working thing, I couldn't watch TV, I couldn't read books, I couldn't play video games, all things that I had loved to do before. But the one thing that I could actually do to occupy my mind was jigsaw puzzles. I don't know why, maybe it just uses a different part of your brain that lets you do something and get a sense of completion. Jay's sister actually subscribed me to a jigsaw puzzle subscription service, so I got a new one in the mail every now and again. Random, super helped me there. But still, my brain's not working well. One piece of advice that my mum gave me, she was also a widower at a fairly young age, was just don't make any big decisions in that first year. And I think that's good advice. And get that support network around you to help you make the decisions that you do need to make in the meantime before you get there. Jenny talked about the benefits of therapy earlier on. Therapy helped me too, another benefit through work. Something I had never done before, but it did help talking through that process with a couple of therapists. I didn't keep with it though. I don't have code review anxiety, Carol, but I do have life review anxiety. And just after a while, I just ran out of things to talk about with my therapist. I'm an introvert. I got the black yellow lane now because I want to talk to people here, but in general it's hard for me. But I just want to say that the main thing you're going to need to recover is time. Oh, there's my next slide. There we go. All right, so I don't have any call to action here. I don't have a blog post, I don't have a book, I don't have a podcast, anything like that. But I do have my speaker slides, speaker notes from my slides right here. I just changed all the bullet points to check boxes so it looks like a checklist. So if you find that useful, you're welcome to it. First of all, and just to wrap up, I want to say thank you for, especially the Red Monk team, for allowing me to give this talk. Some men would rather give a presentation like this in public rather than go back to therapy. That's me. But I just want to end with my last real call to action, which is to tell that special someone that you love them, because you never know when it's going to be their last day. And I love you, Johnny. Thank you so much for bringing me with us. And thank you all for being here today.